Hello there, and welcome to a GCSE English Paper 1 walkthrough for Pearson 2.0. This is getting us ready for the first paper, which this year, 2025, will be sat this Friday. This is an opportunity for us to talk generally about the different questions and what is expected of those questions, and make sure we're right on our timing, make sure we're really ready for this exam and we're really familiar with what the examiner is looking for us. And I've created more of a generic walkthrough in terms of a reference to sort of the phrasing of the questions on every past paper, although I have used the most recent past paper, which is obviously November 24. Just to give us a little bit of insight into how the phrasing of the questions work on actual real papers. So November 24 will be available on the Pearson website, particularly for teachers. So yeah, you might find that useful to sort of pull that out to walk alongside this session. Okay, and just to remind us then that this exam paper, paper 1 of Pearson 2.0, has a total of 80 marks split into two parts. So section A is responding to two texts that you're given to read, so 19th century non-fiction texts written in the 1800s, and obviously with that comes some sort of distinct attitudes and ideas and approaches to the topics that we need to remember might be different to our own in modern day. And section B, we have our transaction writing tasks. So we're writing for a purpose. We might be asked to write things like a letter or a review or a blog or an article. And we're usually asked to write for a particular purpose, such as to persuade or to advise, argue or inform. So something along those lines in order to hit the marks for section B. As always, I recommend that you might like to highlight or underline words or phrases as you read through the texts. That's a really good tip. I would always recommend that you take a highlighter to all of my students into the exam, because there's otherwise quite a lot of quotes and things that you might want to remember, and also to make sure that you're picking out the key points in your questions. And you might decide to choose to read one text before answering the first three questions, rather than both texts and then the entire set of questions. And the reason why that's a technique that you might find useful is because you don't have to do any kind of comparison in paper 1. So to read the first text and then do the first three questions, if you're someone who finds it quite challenging to sort of remember all the content of two texts, that might be your way forward. But I would always suggest that if you haven't practiced doing some of these techniques before, don't do them for the first time in the real exam. Maybe take a practice paper or two in the run up to the exam and just have a go at doing that to see how that feels. So in terms of the breakdown of the questions, you have 6 questions, and I've highlighted here for you the focus of the questions because, as you might know from my previous video about evaluation on paper 1, evaluation is done a lot on this paper. So we have 3 questions which are evaluation questions. So question 2, question 5, and question 6. I'll talk about those in more detail as we go through today. And we have 1 language question only, and we have 2 questions where we find information from the text, which should be our quick wins. And as I've mentioned there for you before, you've got your transactional writing. So in terms of the timing of the paper, my advice on both paper 1 and paper 2 is the same, and that you would spend about 1 hour and 10 minutes on section A, the reading section, and 45 minutes on section B, your transactional writing question. Same advice as before on paper 2 as well as paper 1. If you are a really great writer but less confident on your reading, although I'm not suggesting or advising that you should do this, it is an option for you to do the writing first. But of course, if you do that, please make sure that you keep a good eye on the time. And in 45 minutes have passed, definitely stop your writing and go on to do the reading questions. Because as I've said here in the right-hand box on the PowerPoint, be clear on how long to spend on each question and keep an eye on the time. Because if you're well over time, move on. It's better to attempt all questions and only attempt half of the paper. Otherwise, you're really going to cut down your chances and your opportunities to get that elusive grade 4 or more. So consider strategies for a course that might work for you. As I've mentioned before, discuss with your tutor, doing things that are a little bit different from the norm, such as writing first, or such as just reading the first text and then answering the first 3 questions before you do the next text and the next 3 questions. Do get advice from somebody who knows you and works really well with you before you actually do that. And don't try these strategies for the first time in the actual exam. Obviously, some people are entitled to extra time, so you need to do the maths on that. But I would always suggest that each mark indicates roughly sort of to the nearest 5 minutes. So, for example, a 4 mark question, spend about 5 minutes on it. A 6 mark question, spend about 10 minutes on it. 8 marks, about 10 minutes. 12 marks, about 15 minutes. So round it up to the nearest five to get an indication of how long you should spend on your questions. It's a very rough ready reckoner, but it stops you having to remember figures when you get into that exam. Just look at the marks that are available for that question, and it gives you a bit of a nudge about how long you should be spending on the questions, just to make sure that you've had an opportunity to attempt all of them. Okay, and when we're talking about question one, which is worth 4 marks, you need to spend no more than 5 minutes on this question. But to be honest, you're probably quite likely to be able to do this much quicker. It is an opportunity for an easy win. And the phrasing of the question will always be really similar for question one, only the focus of it will change. So for example, it would say something along the lines of identify 4 points that the writer makes about. And if you look at any past paper, you'll see that on the section for the responses, there are 4 different lines, each numbered 1 to 4. So it's really clear that you need 4 points. Make sure each of your answers give different information and spend no more than 5 minutes on this question. You will have an image for text one. Don't discuss the image. The image is there for you to give you a bit of an idea about what the text is about and to help you as a bit of a sort of a foot up, but don't talk about it in order to help you to answer the question. Don't quote from it. Don't say, you know, in the picture it shows this, because it's not going to be allowing you to get any marks awarded to you for that. So from the November 2024 paper, which was about reading, we would identify 4 points that the writer makes about reading. So you can see that the example of that question there follows the format that I mentioned on the previous slide. And you'd simply need to skim through the text, finding 4 different things that it states about reading. It should be really simple. You should be able to pick out quotes, or you can paraphrase. You don't need to write loads and loads. You don't need to put a big long quote. Just pick out the words and phrases that you need. For example, I think from memory, something like children enjoy reading. So that would be a point about reading. In question 2, it's the first of our evaluation texts, and I have a separate video about that called How to Evaluate Pearson 2.0 that I really recommend that you watch for more detailed sort of coaching really on how to answer any of the evaluation questions on paper 1. But first, we have to recognise that on question 2, our phrasing again is always very similar. And this time we have to focus on an extract, which we are guided to by line numbers. So an example might be in lines 1 to 9, the writer tries to, and then you'll normally have a focus of purpose of the text. So something like persuade or inform or convince, something along those lines about what the text is actually trying to do. And you need to decide how successful that is. So you evaluate how successful this is achieved and give 3 reasons for your opinion and use examples from the text. So top tips on this one is spend about 10 minutes on this question because it's worth 6 marks. And I would always suggest that you write your 3 separate reasons for your opinion in 3 separate paragraphs. So it's really clear for the examiner where your different ideas are and they don't have to trawl through. Always make it really easy for the examiner to award you marks. Don't hide those marks. Make it easy for them to be able to award you for what you've done. And so an example of the phrasing of this question in November 24 is in lines 1 to 9, the writer is trying to show the different ways that people learn to enjoy reading. So as you can see there, the format is exactly as I've said. You've got the line numbers and you've got the purpose of the text that it's trying to show the different ways. And you again have to evaluate how successfully it's managed to show the different ways that people enjoy reading. So you're looking for evidence of a couple of reasons why it is successful in showing that people enjoy reading. And I would always recommend that you try and find a reason why maybe it's not as successful. So, more tips for evaluation questions. Comment on the success of the text with the focus. Don't give your opinion on the topic. It's not asking you to tell us what you think of reading or whether you enjoy reading. It's asking you to tell us whether you agree that the text is successful in getting that idea or opinion across. Always stick to the lines stated in the question. I would really recommend that you highlight in the question the actual line number reference. If you don't do that, you are running the risk of answering from the wrong section. And again, similarly, I would recommend that you then find the text, those lines in the text, and highlight where they are as well, because it is really easy to make a mistake and to be able to pull out your information from the wrong section, which, you know, you're never going to lose marks, but you definitely are going to waste your time by answering on something that you're not going to get marks for. Each of your 3 reasons need to be in separate paragraphs, as I've mentioned, and each of those 3 paragraphs needs to have an example from the text to back up your point. So you need a quotation or a reference to suggest why you think or feel the way you do, and an explanation of how that helps you to agree or not. So try and use the PEE format, or you might call that a different thing if you're in a different, college or institution. Point, evidence, explanation in a nutshell, where you make your point, do you agree? You give your evidence, the quote, and then you explain how that quote actually helps you to show an understanding of whether you do or don't agree. There is no need to comment in these evaluation questions on the writer's techniques, such as similes or metaphors. You might find it useful to do that if you're a higher level candidate. So you might say, with the use of this simile, it makes me feel it's successful because, but you don't need to peel back those layers of those words and phrases and really analyze it. You just need to talk about how it helps you to agree or disagree with the question. So when you're writing your answer to an evaluation question, I always suggest that you state your opinion of how successful the text is before you do anything else. I would recommend that you try and make it partially successful. And my reason for that is because it allows you to have a detached critical evaluation, which allows you access to those 5 to 6 marks, to the higher level marks. If you only completely agree, it is more difficult for the examiner to be able to look at the mark scheme and award you the highest level of marks, because you have just given your own point of view and not thought about how other people might interpret it. Give your first reason with the evidence from the text to support. So first of all, starting off, I partially agree, then your first reason why you do agree, and then give your evidence, your quote to back that up and how that quote helps you to show that you do agree. Then give your second reasons and your third reasons, each with supporting evidence. You need a quote for each point you make. I recommend you state that it's partially successful with 2 reasons for success and 1 reason why it's not, allowing you access to the higher marks. And here I'm just showing you the mark scheme of how the examiner will mark your work. So the second bullet point onto the top level here, sustained and detached critical evaluation offered with convincing personal judgment about the text, which indicates that you're not only able to say what you feel about whether you agree or not with the success of the text, but you also think about how somebody else might not agree. For example, you might say that although it does manage to convince us that it's exploring the idea of reading really, really well, there are some elements of reading that it doesn't explore or doesn't talk about. And so some people might feel that it doesn't cover those ideas fully. So writing your answer to question 2, then 3 reasons in 3 paragraphs, point, evidence, explanation, and then you want something like, I think the writer is partly successful at persuading the reader that, and then think about the focus of the question. So I think the first question that I showed you today was something along the lines of being able to show an enjoyment of reading. The text successfully shows, and then you talk about what it shows, and you give a couple of quotes, 1 or 2 quotes, and say that this creates a feeling or impression of, or suggests that. So some nice sentence starters here for you to suggest, why it does help you to show that it's successful. Then you'd have another paragraph. You might start it with the word secondly, and then you could talk about another reason with a quote about why it is successful. And then your third paragraph might be something along the lines of, however, the writer does not explain, and then you might go into detail about what it fails to do to make it fully successful, and simply state, and you'd give a quote to back your ideas up, which implies. You might find it useful to do a final line that just kind of overall summarizes your point. Overall, there is some success. You may feel that you don't need to do that. It depends how well you think you've explored your ideas in the first 3 paragraphs. Okay, so for the question that I just mentioned, question 2, again, as I said, there is a separate video about that, how to evaluate Pearson 2.0. So I do suggest that if you need a little bit more help on that, that you go and watch that video separately. Okay, question 3 is your one and only language analysis question on this paper. And the focus of the question isn't going to be very specific. It's simply going to be stating, how does the writer use language here to interest and inform the reader? So looking at all the past question 3s on paper 1, you'll notice that the phrasing of the question is exactly the same. So really, because you don't have a specific focus, you've simply got to pull out what interests you and informs you, because of course you are a reader. And of course, it says what you need to include, the writer's use of language and the effect on the reader, and examples from the whole text and relevant subject terminology, which of course you're going to do anyway if you're going to follow the format of PEE or a similar phrasing, Peter, petal, whatever it is that you've been taught to do, to include all those components of language analysis. So focus on which words and phrases stand out from the whole text. Do they make you feel a certain way or imagine something? As this is non-fiction, you're more likely to spot effective techniques that fit a purpose, for example, deforest techniques. Now, for anybody who doesn't follow that idea, deforest is a way or an acronym of remembering some of the persuasive techniques that you might use. So, for example, direct address, alliteration, fact, opinion, rhetorical question, emotive language, statistics, and the rule of 3. Of course, there are other persuasive techniques, but this is a way of remembering lots of them. More so, you'll be finding things like this than figurative techniques, but it doesn't mean the figurative techniques won't be there. You might still have things like similes and metaphors, for example. But thinking about, are they effective? How are they effective? Why are they effective? And I'm a big fan of reminding people to not play terminology bingo. I think in the past, people perhaps might have been taught to look for techniques, when really what we want you to be doing here is to look at the text and see, what words or phrases stand out at me as being particularly interesting or particularly informative to the reader, and then peel that back and work out what techniques the writer has used and how they've been effective. So what has the writer said? What have they used? How have they got those ideas across to you? And why have they done that? What's the effect of that? Again, just a reminder, as this is worth 8 marks, I would spend about 10 minutes on this question. And as you've got quite a lot of language analysis questions to do on paper 2, you're probably quite familiar with this now. An example of this question on the past paper that I've referred to, so November 24, about reading. How does the writer use language to interest and inform the reader? Again, as you'll see, this question is exactly the same as the structure of the generic question that I've said to you, so it should not change. And how to do it? Well, I've simplified this in the term of PEE paragraphs, but again, don't change now. If you're used to Peter or petal or another way of structuring your response, don't change that now, a few days before your exam. But of course, do think about that structure and use that structure in response to your question. But what this question is about is showing an understanding of the power of words. So showing an understanding of how you've been affected by those words as you are reading the text, because as I said, you are the reader. So pick out some interesting quotes. I would aim for 3. Okay, you might find more than that, but pick the 3 that you feel you can talk the most confidently about. Explain in detail what you imagine or understand or learn from those words or phrases, what they tell you, how they interest you, how they inform you. And try to include subject terminology, but that can simply be word classes. So have a look at the text. What do you think is the most interesting word here? What word class is it? So is it a verb? Is it an adjective? Just naming those things is language analysis. Can you recognize a technique that the writer has used? I've mentioned deforest before, or maybe it might be an imperative, a bossy verb that's telling you to do something if it's writing to instruct or advise. Or there might be a modal verb that's present, a should, a could, a might, which is gently advising. Or it might be a superlative, best, greatest. Might be some figurative language, such as the use of a metaphor. And I think from memory, there were some metaphors in the reading question for text A for November 24. I think there were a few metaphors that referenced sort of being hungry for reading. Think about the effect of the word. How did it make you feel? What ideas do we associate with this word? So peel it back and really think about analysing it. So just a bit of a reminder here then, point, evidence, explanation in terms of the structure of your response. State your point, what is it that has interested you? What's your evidence, your quotes from the text? Explain how they help you to prove your point. Don't waste time with an introduction or conclusion, just answer the question and support everything that you talk about with evidence. Always think about the effect on the reader and who those readers might be. I don't just want you to list a load of techniques because that will not be enough. Think about the how and the why a certain language feature has been used. It will stop you then just talking about what feature has been used. And use evidence from the text if you can. So a sample answer might be similar to this. The writer interests us with the adjective, and then you do the quote, which implies that, and the writer might feel, and the writer makes me think of. So what we're doing here is we're explaining what the quote shows to us, what we understand from it. But if we want to peel it back and analyze it, we might almost consider it like an onion and peel away the layers. So you could say something like, this might also be seen as, so give a different interpretation of it, which is possibly something that may be attractive and interesting to contemporary readers, and they may feel that, and then again, delve into what they might think and feel as the connotations are. So what words, what do those words make you think of? What do they suggest to you? To play around with sort of diving into it much more if you're going to be working towards that analysis, which will get you those higher marks. You need to do that 3 times really, or one really well-developed response, which looks at a number of different techniques, all under one umbrella. But I think it's probably easier to look for 3 separate ideas. Okay, so for question 4, this is one of your easy wins again, because this time it's on text 2, and you're going to be looking for explicit information, which just like on question 1, is simply going to be picking out information that's right there in front of you. You've got an entire text to look at this time. It is a much larger text for you, and in theory, you should be able to skim through this quite quickly and pull out some ideas. So remember to refer to the correct lines though, because there is going to be a phrasing on this question that asks you again to look at a particular set of line numbers. So highlight that in the question, highlight the line numbers on the text so you answer about the right thing. You can use quotes again, or you can paraphrase it into your own words, and make sure that your answers are relevant to the question and that they make sense. If they don't make sense, you might need a tiny weeny little explanation just to go with it, but I would suggest you don't do too much of an explanation, otherwise you are going to run out of time. You should really only spend a couple of minutes on this question. Question B, 4B, is where you find more explicit information. This time you have an extract provided, and you are going to be looking for words and phrases that imply or suggest something. It's not going to be quite so obvious, so you have to be able to read between the lines a little bit more and show that you understand the connotations or the suggested meaning. You might need to have an explanation to go with your example or your quote to make sure it's really clear what you're saying, but again, you need to do this in a very simplified, quick time. So simply something like implies or suggests, and then explain what it is. So an example of that from November 24 and how that breaks down is 4 marks in total, but divided into the 2 sections. So the first section, lines 4 to 12, in this case, identify 2 points the writer makes about Muddies and other libraries. You can see that you'll be able to pick out those 2 points from lines 4 to 12, which you will have highlighted in the text so that you don't pull it out from the wrong part. And then B, you've got an extract that you can actually look at on the page, you can highlight on your exam paper, and then you can pull out 2 reasons why groups of people subscribe to Muddies libraries. And again, it's not going to be quite so obvious. It's not going to say 2 reasons why they subscribe is. You're going to have to read between the lines and pull out that information. And you might need to add a little bit of tiny explanation to go with it, but all in 5 minutes or less, preferably. Question 5 is your next evaluation question. This time your evaluation is going to be of text 2, and you're going to have an extract. So you don't need to evaluate the entire text. You'll have an extract to look at. And the phrasing is going to be something like, in the extract, the writer tries to, and again, there'll be a particular focus, just like there was in question 2. Again, you're going to have to evaluate how successfully this is achieved, and you're going to give 3 reasons for your opinion and use examples from the extract, and you're going to gain 6 marks for that, and you're going to do that in 10 minutes. So an example here would be, in the extract, the writer tries to persuade readers that books from Muddies library will provide entertainment for everyone. Evaluate how successfully this is achieved and give 3 reasons for your opinion and use examples from the extract. So again, I would like you to look through the extract, and I'd like you to highlight or pull out a couple of reasons why it is successful in persuading readers that books from Muddies library will provide entertainment for everyone, and 1 reason perhaps why it does not. Okay, so in terms of the structure of your response to this, it's going to be exactly the same really as question 2, and that I suggest that you have 3 separate paragraphs, 2 of which are going to explore why it is successful, making your point that it is successful, giving your evidence, and then of course, explaining how your evidence helps you to come to your point of view. And your final paragraph, I would suggest, is a reason why you don't think it's successful. I would always start off your response to these questions with, I agree to a certain extent, or it is partially successful, or a similar phrasing of that, because that allows the examiner to very quickly tick off that you have expressed an opinion before you've done anything else. So answering question 5 then, as I mentioned, is very similar to question 2. Both ask you to evaluate an extract and give 3 reasons. Just remember that I have done a separate video for you about how to evaluate, so I will go into more detail about these question types and your structuring of your responses, which I recommend you watching. But your top tips are to make a judgment on how well the writer has achieved their aims. So in this case, persuading. Use phrases such as I think and I feel, and I would argue that because, and give your 3 reasons in 3 separate paragraphs. Support each reason with an example or a quote, and I recommend agreeing partially to access the higher grades for the reasons that I explained earlier on, giving 10 minutes. Now, just popping back to this previous slide, there is an opportunity sometimes in the phrasing of the question, and I will talk more about this in a moment, to find reasons why you might not agree that it's successful. And one of my suggestions or ideas here, if I just find my annotating tool, is this word, everyone. Okay, now the word everyone is an interesting word because, of course, it's bias or exaggerated in the fact that it is allowing us to put everybody into the same category. So what I would suggest you do in this instance and in the others that use this kind of phrasing is an opportunity for you to look and see whether everyone is actually addressed. So perhaps we might want to be just, off the top of my head, thinking about the fact that, in the 1800s, there were many people who are not literate, and therefore, is it addressing everybody? That idea of being able to access books from a library without that sort of tool of helping people to actually be able to read in the first place. So it's something along those lines you might be able to look at. And consider, of course, the fact that these texts are written at a different time to the time that we currently live in. So our attitudes, our abilities, our access to things like education, for example, in this instance, are very different. And definitely that is an opportunity for us to be able to talk about that. Okay, let's just move on. All right, so evaluating a whole text is what we'll need to do for question 6. And for this question, we refer to the whole of text 2. So although we get 12 marks for this, we don't really have to do a huge amount more in terms of the writing element of it, but we have to work a bit harder to gain our information because we've got an entire text to read. Similarly to that, we have to work a little bit harder because this time we're not going to talk about the success of the text and whether we agree it's successful, but we're going to have to talk about our agreement on whether or not we agree with a statement that somebody else has said. So your phrasing of your question will be something like, for this question, refer to the whole of text 2. In my view, this text shows, and there'll be a statement that you have to decide whether you agree or not. It's usually relatively biased, it's usually relatively exaggerated, and so you will have opportunities to be able to pull those elements of it out. Based on your evaluation of the text, how far do you agree with this opinion? Use examples from the text to support your evaluation. Okay, so how do we get 12 marks on this question? Here is an example of the question that is question 6 on November 24. In my view, this text shows Muddy's libraries will improve everyone's lives. Based on your evaluation of the text, how far do you agree with this opinion? Use examples from the text to support your evaluation. So without even reading the text, I'm hoping that you can see here that there are opportunities for an exploration of bias or exaggeration. How can a library improve everyone's lives in the 1800s? Of course, there were lots of social issues and social problems in the 1800s, as there are now, but possibly some of them quite exaggerated or different, perhaps, to the issues that we've got now. And what you would need to be able to do is to recognise that the libraries, although they would definitely improve some people's lives, are probably not going to improve everyone's. Okay, so just thinking again about the use of the word everyone in this statement is a really interesting one. And when I think back to all the past question sixes in all the past papers that have happened so far and the sample assessment materials that are available, you should notice, I think all but 1 year or all but one example, there is a use of a word such as everyone or all, which allows us that sort of commentary on that bias element of it and how we can't completely agree with the phrasing of the statement because of those elements. It's your opportunity to explore the context, the fact that it was written in a particular time with different attitudes and different ideas. And talking about that and exploring that allows you to hit that mark of a detached critical evaluation, where you think about your own sort of thoughts and ideas associated with the statement, but also how other people, particularly people at the time, might have felt in comparison to now. So again, a suggestion that I would start with a response such as I partly agree with the statement rather than I completely agree or I mostly agree. Of course, if you can't see any reasons why you only partly agree, any reasons perhaps why you don't agree at all, then I would just go with the agree element. It's better to do 3 reasons why you agree than nothing at all. But of course, if you can sort of explore these elements of it, then that's going to allow you access to the higher marks. So it includes someone else's interpretation of the text, and you need to decide how far you agree with it. Again, I've explored this concept much more in the evaluation video. Okay, so make a quick plan to help you stay focused on this question. It is a large question. It's a lot of text to read through. So you definitely need to highlight the evidence in the text to make sure that you stay on plan. You might want to make some notes to just remind you about the reasons why you do agree and the reasons maybe why you don't. You could annotate the question. You could pull out some of the bias or exaggerated phrasing of that question as an opportunity to explore there. Start by stating how far you agree. So I recommend that you partially agree. For example, I would aim to make at least 3 well-developed points with the supporting evidence, 2 of which you might agree with and 1 why you might not. And use a clear structure such as your PEE, so your point, your evidence, you explain. You don't need to refer to the writer's techniques again, as I've mentioned before on the other evaluation questions, though you might find that a tool to do so if you are a higher level candidate, but you certainly don't need to analyse. Consider who may not agree and remember the time and the context that the text was written in comparison to present day attitudes. And that is in the structure as shown here. So I partially agree with the quotation because, and then secondly, and then a however, and you might want an overall I think kind of statement as well at the end, just to pull your ideas together. Something like this. I think the statement is partially correct in that. The statement is right in that the text successfully shows by using, and you'd give your quotes, your evidence, and you might say, this creates a feeling or impression of, or suggests that. And then you'd have a second paragraph that explores similar concept, but maybe with some different evidence. And then finally, I don't agree with the statement because, and then some overall sort of summative comment. And that concludes us exploring section A. So I'm just going to do a light touch on section B, because I think section B isn't much different perhaps to a lot of other exam boards, and you're probably much more familiar with the writing element of this exam board for those reasons. But of course, just to remember that section B, you have a choice of 2 questions here. They are always going to be focused on transactional writing with a specific purpose. One of the questions, question 7, will be really great for students who struggle to know how to start, because it actually gives you the start. So this example here from November 2024, write a blog with the title, How to Choose the Best Job. A student has started a response to this task. So I'd always recommend to you that you pull to pieces this question in terms of looking for the genre that you're asked to write. In this case, of course, it's a blog, and making sure you're really clear on the generic conventions of a blog. So what is it the examiner wants you to be able to demonstrate in terms of the language and structural techniques, things like subheadings, for example, and that direct address, that sort of colloquial, chatty, relaxed language. Think about also the audience, so who you're actually writing for. In this case, if it's how to choose the best job, it might perhaps be aimed at a younger audience, perhaps. So you want to think about who your audience is for and use language that's appropriate for that. But of course, always making sure your spelling and punctuation and your grammar are the best they could possibly be, because you are going to be assessed on that on section B, whereas you weren't on section A. And then thinking about the purpose. So why is it that you're writing? So how to choose the best job, of course, is to advise. So make sure that you have some language features that you would expect to find in writing to advise, such as those lovely modal verbs, should, could, might, etc. That gentle sort of coaxing and suggestion. So your example here on how you could start is there is a lot to think about when choosing a job. Will I enjoy it and how much will I earn? Do I have the skills or qualification, or will they train me? Do I want a permanent or temporary job, and will it be full-time or part-time? And I think just looking at this gives you an idea about the kind of language you should use. It gives you an idea about that sort of relaxed nature, the use of the rhetorical questions to really directly address your audience. And from that, consider that style and carry on from that. You don't have to write this whole thing out. That would be a time waster. So we can assume that you're carrying on from there. However, there is nothing to say that you can't pop in a device or two before this text. You won't be penalized for that. For example, you might want to start off with something anecdotal, and then your second paragraph might be using this text. And that's absolutely fine. You won't be penalized for doing that if you feel that that's something you want to do. Question 8 is really great for people who struggle with knowing how to structure their responses. So let's have a look at this example. Write an article for an employment website aimed at young adults with the title, How to Make a Good Impression, a Guide to a Successful Interview. Again, I would say that this is probably going to be another advice piece of writing. It's interesting that both of these questions were advisory. So same ideas in terms of the language features for advice. Again, probably a very similar audience as well. So thinking about the language features you want to use to address this particular audience. But this time we've got an article. So again, think about the structural features that you'd expect to have in an article. In terms of the advice on how to structure this, use those bullet points. I would say that 5 paragraphs is a great amount to aim for in terms of your writing. So I would suggest that your first paragraph should be introductory, talking about, the overall attitudes to perhaps interviews and how, maybe addressing an idea about how interviews might feel for a student for the first time. Your second bullet point, so your second idea can address the first bullet point. So advice on preparation and presentation. So what should you do? Your next bullet point is your next paragraph. What should you say and do? And then your final paragraph, or penultimate paragraph, I should say, is what you should not say and do. Your final paragraph should be some kind of summative idea, maybe something a little bit more like a call to action, or a little bit of a cheer on in terms of, good luck and you will smash it, something really sort of fun and chatty like that. Remember, though, that your responses to these questions will be marked on the accuracy and appropriate use of vocabulary, spelling, and grammar. And that's really, really important to remember. Here are the assessment objectives for section B. So communicate clearly, effectively, and imaginatively, selecting and adapting tone, style, and register for different purposes, forms, and audiences. So those forms mean, is it a blog? Is it a letter? Have you got the right features for that? Purposes, is it to persuade? Is it to advise? If it's to persuade, have you got those deforest features that I mentioned earlier? If it's to advise, have you got those modal verbs? And audiences, have you got a language or structure that is appropriate for your audience? Organize information ideas using structural and grammatical features to support coherence and cohesion of text. So think about, obviously, paragraphing. It'll be very difficult for you to get that elusive grade 4 if you don't use paragraphs. Make sure you're really clear on how to use those. And there's lots of advice out there about that. But also in terms of the cohesion of your text, use discourse markers like firstly, secondly, alternatively, however, to show those ideas as you move through your text and show the examiner that you've really thought about your structure. You can also show the examiner that you thought about your structure with the use of the planning box. I highly recommend that you use that because it is an opportunity to make sure that your work is structured really well. But the examiner might be able to use that to see where you were going with your concepts and ideas if for any reason you don't manage to finish your text. And assessment objective 6, using a range of vocabulary and sentence structures for clarity, purpose, and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. Now, in terms of this, if you are writing for a very relaxed audience, such as for a blog, you're writing to a young audience, for example, that doesn't mean that you ditch your language that is appropriate for purpose and effect. You might not be coming out with really high-level vocabulary, but you will be showing that you're using words for a particular effect. So you can still hit that criteria if you think carefully about the language choices that you choose. Showing off your knowledge of things like direct address, alliteration, fact, opinion, and so on, if relevant. So just as a summary to that then, highlight the genre, the audience and the purpose in the question and be clear on the requirements of the format. So make sure you know what a letter should look like, an email should look like. There's loads of videos out there about that. Consider your audience. This will affect your writing style in terms of perhaps the level of formality. Think about the language techniques that you're going to use. You know, DeForest, for example, if your text is persuasive, fact, opinion, etc., modal verbs for advice, and so on. Make a quick plan and organize your ideas into clear paragraphs. Use a wide vocabulary and varied punctuation. So think about using not only, the obvious things like your full stops, your capital letters, your commas, and your apostrophes correctly, but experiment and make sure that you use things like your colons, your semicolons, your brackets, perhaps even ellipsis for a particular effect. Think about using your cohesive devices, firstly, secondly, etc. Proofread your work and check for really clear meaning, a range of punctuation and accurate spelling and paragraphing. It's amazing how many silly mistakes that you pick up just from reading back. Some spelling mistakes, some lack of full stops or capital letters, which could make a big difference to you. Consider your appropriate structure. For example, if it's a letter, think about how you might start and end the letter. Yours faithfully if it's dear sir or madam, yours sincerely if it's dear Mrs. Hassan, for example. Think about headings, subheadings for articles, and so on. And although you won't necessarily see this written down anywhere, aim for about 600 words of writing. And the reason that I suggest that is because for most students, that's about 2 sides of the exam booklet. And usually that's about enough for us to be able to see that you know your stuff and for you to be able to demonstrate your ability. Write much less than that. And sometimes you might not got your ideas across well. If you write much more than that, it can become a bit waffly and lose that structure. So that is my overall sort of idea of success for this. So that in a nutshell is how to do paper 1 for Pearson 2.0. And all that's left for me to say is the absolute best of luck and keep an eye out for some more videos to come that will help you with your paper 2 preparation and revision. Thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you all soon.